My name's Doug Sarno, and for the past almost 5 years, I've been lucky enough to serve as the technical facilitator for the community here on the activities surrounding the feasibility study. So I and the folks on the Community Advisory Committee that have been working with us over the past few years are very happy to see this day. And I'm going to be serving just as a little bit of a master of ceremonies tonight, move us through the process. So let me just explain how the evening's going to work. In a few moments, we're going to have a short video, which is going to provide a bit of a background on the site, on the cleanup process, and the process getting us to this point in the decision. Then we'll have a break. We'll be changing over the posters. The posters that are in the back right now are background posters, and they are there just to kind of remind people where we've been. Those posters are the same posters that you've seen at the last couple of public meetings. But during the video that we're going to play, we're going to switch those out, and we'll have posters of the proposed remedy that you're going to hear about in the presentation as well. So we're going to have about 15-20 minutes of the video, about 45 minutes to talk to the Corps and ask any questions about that during that period. Then we'll come back, we'll have a short presentation, and then we'll have the formal public comment period. If you want to be in the formal public comment period, you're to sign up out front. So if you haven't signed up and you do want to speak, please do that. Everybody will be given 3 minutes to speak in that formal period. Because we have formal public comment tonight, we're not going to be asking questions at the microphone. If you have questions or you want to talk to any of the Corps or contractors who are in the back, they'll be there all night. We'll be here till 9 o'clock. So all your questions will get answered. But we want to have time at the microphone for the formal public comment period. So that's how that will work, and we'll talk about that more as we get closer. But before we dive into tonight's program, we want to honor Joan Gipp. Joan was a town of Lewiston councilwoman and one of the area's first environmental activists. And it was really Joan that raised the alarm back in the 1980s about the materials here on site and asked that more be done and more be looked at, got the National Academies of Sciences involved, and in a lot of ways started the ball rolling on the process that ended here, that is going to be announced here tonight in terms of the remedy that's going to be put into place at the Niagara Falls storage site, at least for the IWCS. Joan passed away about 2 weeks ago, but not before she learned about this remedy, and so it brought a very large smile to her face, and we're all pleased at that. So I'd like to just offer just a moment of silence, if we could, for Joan. Thank you. I would also, just before we get rolling tonight, thank all of you for being here and all of you who've been here through this process. I think citizen involvement, obviously it's what I do for a living, but beyond that, it's so important to a process like this. It's been incredibly important to this process. I know that I've appreciated the opportunity of working with you folks, and the Corps has appreciated all the great input they've gotten. I think citizens don't get thanked enough for their participation. Sometimes it can seem a little controversial and a little contentious, but we always know that you're giving up your time, you're giving up your energy, and you're doing this out of true passion for your community, and so I want to express my thanks for that. And that's why we're here tonight, to share this news, and you'll hear from the Corps in a little bit. This video you're about to see, the Corps just recently finished. It was a response to a community desire to, as we came to these public meetings, a lot of folks hadn't been here in a while, or this was their first public meeting, and they often ask, you know, how do I catch up? How do I learn what's going on here? How do I get a better sense of the past? And that's what this video does. It provides us a nice setting of how things got to be at the Niagara Falls storage site and a little bit about where we're headed. So it's going to be about 15-20 minutes, and then I'll call us back to the posters. Start video.
Niagara Falls Storage Site, or NFSS, is located on a portion of a former 7,500-acre Department of Defense site called the Lake Ontario Ordnance Works, or LOW, which was built on agricultural lands that were acquired by the government during 1942 in the towns of Lewiston and Porter in New York State. LOW was built for the purpose of manufacturing trinitrotoluene, or TNT, to be used in World War II. TNT production ceased and the facility was decommissioned within 1 year of commencing operations. About 1,500 acres from the southern portion of the LOW production area were transferred to the Manhattan Engineer District in 1944. This area was called the Lake Ontario Storage Area. During and after World War II, the Manhattan Engineer District contracted with processing facilities in various parts of the country to extract uranium from ore to create the uranium metal needed to develop atomic bombs. The unused ore material that remained after the extraction process is called residue. The extraction process did not remove all radioactivity contained in the ore material, and therefore the residue material also contains radionuclides, mainly radium. Some of these radioactive residues and wastes from uranium ore processing were stored in the Lake Ontario storage area. The residues with the highest activity, called the K65s, were stored in a concrete silo on the site, which was previously used as a water storage tank. Other high-activity residues, called L30, F32, and L50, were stored in buildings that were part of the original low water treatment plant. These residues were taken to the Lake Ontario storage area because they were thought to have sufficient concentrations of uranium and other metals and low but recoverable concentrations of precious metals that would have future economic value. Low-activity residues, called the R10 residues, were stored in an above-ground mound called the R10 pile, located north of the freshwater treatment plant. The Manhattan Engineer District became the Atomic Energy Commission in 1946. Radioactive materials were periodically shipped to the Lake Ontario storage area for storage through 1954. The formerly utilized Site's Remedial Action Program, commonly referred to as FUSREP, was initiated in 1974 to identify, investigate, and clean up or control sites throughout the United States that were contaminated by activities associated with the nation's early atomic weapons and energy programs. The Department of Energy, or DOE, was activated in 1977 and became responsible for the implementation of the program. Radiation is the emission of energy that occurs when an atom, the basic unit of matter, is unstable and changes into a more stable form. Radiation is classified into two main categories, non-ionizing and ionizing, depending on its ability to ionize matter. Ionization is the process by which an atom or molecule acquires a negative or positive charge by gaining or losing electrons to form ions. At FUSREP sites, the primary focus is on ionizing radiation, which has the ability to ionize matter directly or indirectly. Directly ionizing radiation are particles which carry a charge, such as beta or alpha particles, and can directly ionize matter. Alpha particles are large subatomic particles consisting of 2 protons and 2 neutrons, identical to a helium nucleus, which are ejected from the nucleus of some unstable radioactive atoms. They can travel only a few inches through air and can be stopped by a sheet of paper or the outer layers of skin. Beta particles are subatomic particles equivalent to an electron that are ejected from the nucleus of some unstable radioactive atoms. Beta particles are smaller and faster than alpha particles, but can travel further in air. They can easily be stopped by a thin shield, such as a sheet of aluminum foil. A gamma ray is a photon which is emitted from some unstable radioactive atoms. Gamma rays are a type of electromagnetic wave, much like X-rays, and move at the speed of light. They travel farther through air than alpha or beta particles, but can be stopped by a thick shield of lead, steel, or concrete. Of the original 1,500 acres in the Lake Ontario storage area, 191 acres continues to be owned by the federal government and are now known as the Niagara Falls Storage Site, while the remaining acreage is owned by other entities and known as vicinity properties of the NFSS. During 1980, the DOE began cleanup and consolidation of the radioactive wastes and residues that were on the vicinity properties and the site. To contain the contaminated materials from the cleanup and consolidation, this 10-acre earthen interim waste containment structure, or IWCS, was constructed. The IWCS contains approximately 193,230 cubic yards of radioactive residues and wastes. The IWCS was designed to retard radon emissions, infiltration from precipitation, and the migration of radioactive contamination into groundwater. The K-65s were transferred from the silo they were stored in to the smallest bay of Building 411, Bay A, and the remainder was transferred to Bay C. The L-30 and F-32 residues were placed in Bays B, C, and D within the reservoir of Building 411, and the L-50 residues remained in the freshwater system's clarifier tanks, Buildings 413 and 414. This effectively containerizes the residues and provides shielding. Subsurface piping was excavated from the perimeters of the buildings inside the IWCS to an area immediately outside the planned clay dike and cutoff wall. Pipelines within the IWCS were either completely removed or filled and the ends plugged to eliminate possible pathways for the migration of radionuclides and to prevent future subsidence of the compacted wastes. The constructed compacted clay dike and cutoff wall, which completely surrounds the entire waste containment area, was completed during 1983. The clay dike and cutoff walls were both designed to prevent contamination migration into the groundwater. The bottom of the IWCS is formed by two naturally occurring layers of low permeability native clay, a brown clay layer with a layer of gray clay beneath it. The clay cutoff wall extends into the gray clay layer because it is less permeable than the brown clay. The residues were intentionally placed at the bottom and in the middle of the IWCS in order to maximize the distance between the residues and the outside environment. A large and varying layer of waste, comprised of contaminated soil and construction and building debris from the cleanup of the site and the vicinity properties, was placed around and over buildings 411, 413, and 414, and over the R10 residues. The cover contains a 3-foot layer of compacted, low permeability clay. The low permeability of the clay forms the principal barrier to precipitation infiltration and radon emanation. The clay layer is protected by a layer of loosely compacted soil, followed by a layer of topsoil, which is seeded with shallow-rooted turf to prevent erosion of the cover and minimize frost heave damage. The layering of contaminated soil above the residues and wastes, followed by another layer of clean clay soil, minimizes the release of radon gas and gamma radiation. The radon gas moves slowly through the clay and decays, due to its short half-life of 3.8 days, to solid radioactive particulates before reaching the surface of the IWCS. radon does not build up within the IWCS in any measurable amounts. The gamma radiation is also absorbed as it encounters the dense clay solids in the low permeability clay layers. The DOE began monitoring the performance of the IWCS when it was completed in 1986 to ensure that the IWCS was preventing the potential for exposure to the radioactively contaminated material held within it. Additional materials with residual radioactivity from isolated areas across NFSS were added to the top of the IWCS and covered in 1991 by the DOE. When Congress transferred management of the formerly utilized Sites Remedial Action Program from the DOE to the Corps in 1997, the DOE retained ownership of NFSS, and the Corps of Engineers became responsible for the investigation and any remediation of the site. The Corps implements the formerly utilized Sites Remedial Action Program subject to the administrative, procedural, and regulatory provisions of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act as amended, and the National Oil and Hazardous Substances Pollution Contingency Plan. NFSS is divided into 3 operable units: the IWCS operable unit, the Balance of Plant operable unit, which includes all materials outside of the IWCS excluding groundwater, and the groundwater operable unit. A feasibility study will be prepared for each operable unit to develop remedial alternatives appropriate to mitigate potential future unacceptable risks from exposure to radioactively contaminated materials. Currently, the Corps of Engineers is evaluating potential remedial actions for the IWCS operable unit because it allows us to address the residues prior to making decisions regarding the remaining areas of the site. For the purposes of the IWCS operable unit feasibility study, the IWCS was divided into 3 subunits. Subunit A includes all of the high-activity residues placed in buildings 411, 413, and 414, and other wastes placed within the buildings, including contaminated soil and contaminated rubble and/or debris that are commingled with the residues in building 411. The volume for subunit A is 28,440 cubic yards, which is 15% of the waste within the IWCS. However, the materials in subunit A represent 98% of the radioactivity within the IWCS. Subunit B includes debris and wastes placed south of the IWCS clay dike and cutoff wall that abuts Building 411 on both its east and west sides. The materials placed within subunit B make up 22% of the estimated volume within the IWCS. Subunit C makes up the largest percent of the volume of material placed in the IWCS and includes the R10 residues and wastes in the north end of the IWCS. Subunits B and C combined contain 2% of the radioactivity within the IWCS. Once the feasibility study is complete, a preferred alternative will be identified in a proposed plan for each operable unit. The preferred alternative will be based on preliminary balancing trade-offs among alternatives identified in the feasibility study using the 9 criteria specified in the National Contingency Plan. Each proposed plan will be released for public comment, and a public meeting will be held. Once the comments received are considered, a record of decision will document the selected remedial alternative. The Corps has overall responsibility for maintaining the Niagara Falls storage site and ensuring the IWCS continues to effectively contain the radioactive materials within it for the protection of human health and the environment. A high level of maintenance is conducted to preserve the cover and therefore the protectiveness of the cover, which was designed to last 25 to 50 years and is expected to remain effective for at least 50 years, until 2036. The design service life of the clay dike and cutoff walls surrounding the IWCS and the natural gray clay beneath the IWCS was identified as 200 to 1,000 years. Once the Corps of Engineers completes the CERCLA process for all 3 operable units, the NFSS will revert back to the DOE Office of Legacy Management for long-term stewardship. Data collected during environmental monitoring sampling performed at the NFSS since 1986 indicates that the IWCS is performing as designed and that human health and the environment are being protected. The Corps continues to monitor the performance of the IWCS and make adjustments to the environmental surveillance program as necessary.
Okay, and as I said now, the posters are set up in the back of the room to talk about the preferred remedy. We'll call you back up here in about 45 minutes for the presentation. If you want to be in the formal comment period, please make sure you've signed up. Or alternatively, you can speak to a court reporter privately and have your comments put into the record right over here. You can also just provide written comments either to the address on the website, or there's a comment box for comment cards here tonight as well. So I'll call you back up in about 45 minutes. Thanks. Okay, if I can have everybody's attention, please. We're gonna start the formal presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce the Buffalo District Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Carl Jansen, who will kick us off.
All right. Well, hey, good evening, everyone. Very nice to see you here tonight. Cold, snowy, Western New York evening. This level of attendance really is a key symbol of how important this project is to this community, and that it's important to you on a very personal level. So I hope that we deliver what you're looking for here tonight. We're going to be talking about the proposed plan for the interim waste containment structure operable unit of the Niagara Falls storage site, just like you learned in the video. And I'm going to refer to this as the IWCS for short throughout my remarks. Hope you find all of our presentations informative and that our proposal and the supporting rationale earns your trust and confidence. That's what we're after. I extend a special welcome to several officials who are joining us tonight. Chief Leo Henry from the Tuscarora Nation. It was an honor to meet you, sir, for the first time. Mr. Rob Moriali from the Lewiston Council. And I also like to thank our host here at the Senior Center. Made it very cozy on this cold evening, so thank you. The Buffalo District serves the people in the watersheds of the lower Great Lakes, from Messina, New York in the east to the Indiana state line in the west, and we've done so since 1857. We've got many projects within this area of responsibility, but this one is close to home. Many of our nearly 300 employees from the Buffalo District live in this community, and we care about serving all of our fellow citizens and safeguarding them. As we investigate and remediate sites like these, our #1 priority is protection of human health and the environment. This guides our decision-making process. Our preferred alternative that we're proposing tonight is known as alternative number 4. It involves excavation, partial treatment, and out-of-state disposal of the entire contents of the IWCS. This proposal is the result of complex and meticulous analysis that we have performed throughout the feasibility study. In our judgment, this alternative provides the best overall long-term protection of human health and the environment. We estimate that we'll be waiting several years until we can begin remediating the site because there are still some formal steps to accomplish and significant national level program funding must become available. After all, the total price tag of our proposal falls just short of $500 million. And the typical amount in the annual national program to address all sites across the nation is about $100 million. So we'll be waiting for some work at other cleanup sites to conclude until those resources can shift to this one. While we all like to see this site cleaned up as quickly as possible, it's important that I reassure you that the IWCS does not put you at any health risk today or in the near future. The site emits less radiation than typical background conditions. What I mean by that is the radiation that everyone is exposed to on their day-to-day life. We also have over 25 years of data that confirms the IWCS is performing as it was designed and will continue to be protective as long as it is maintained properly. We maintain the site today with a lot of rigor, but it may not be possible to do that for 1,000 or thousands or 10,000s of years. That's why it's prudent to mitigate a future potential risk by removing all of the radioactive material per our proposed plan. The most important part of tonight's meeting is receiving your input on our preferred alternative. A final decision regarding the IWCS will not be made until after all public comments have been considered. Responses to your comments will be outlined in a record of decision, which will be reviewed and approved by the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, Ms. Joanne Darcy. Next slide, please. And one more. And one more. Thank you. This has been a team effort, and we value the partnership and collaboration with all involved. This slide depicts the team, and it certainly starts at the top with the community. We value your input and have incorporated it through the phased development of the feasibility study. I'm only lucky enough to be in Buffalo for 2 years. I've heard the history of this project, the interaction we've had with you over many, many years, and it is important that you know that we hear what you have to say. Moving on down the list, the study and the proposed plan were reviewed by our chain of command, up to Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, who approved the public release, which is where we are now. Moving down, the Corps of Engineers is responsible for conducting investigations and remediation of the site under the FOOSRAP program, which you heard about in the video. We also have overall responsibility for maintaining the site and ensuring that it continues to be protective of human health and the environment in the meantime. Moving down, the U.S. Department of Energy retains ownership of the site. When the Corps of Engineers... Moving on down the list, the study and the proposed plan were reviewed by our chain of command, up to Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, who approved the public release, which is where we are now. Moving down, the Corps of Engineers is responsible for conducting investigations and remediation of the site under the FOOSRAP program, which you heard about in the video. We also have overall responsibility for maintaining the site and ensuring that it continues to be protective of human health and the environment in the meantime. Moving down, the U.S. Department of Energy retains ownership of the site. When the Corps of Engineers completes our activities, the site will be returned to the DOE's Office of Legacy Management for long-term stewardship. Next, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation are regulators who provide comment and input to the Corps of Engineers, but they do not have a direct regulatory authority at the site. Tonight, Mr. Mike Bazile is here representing the US EPA, and Mr. John Mitchell, Mr. Kent Johnson, and Mr. Ken Martin are all here representing the New York State DEC. Thanks to you. We ask that you save your comments until the end of the next presentation so that they can be accurately recorded. If you have a comment and you'd like to read it before us and have it recorded by our stenographer who's here, please make sure that you've checked the box on the card that you filled out when you came in. And Arlene, who is just here to my left, has additional cards if you need one. If you have any questions after the formal comments are recorded, we'll be available back at the posters, and our staff will be happy to meet with you again. And in case you think of additional comments after our session tonight, you can submit them in writing before February 6th. So before we move from this slide, I would just like to recognize the members of the Buffalo District team. And will all of you please either stand up if you're in the audience or raise your hand in the back. All right. Thank you. Hey, these are our technical experts, dedicated, committed, fellow citizens and neighbors. They're here to answer your questions and help you understand what we're proposing on a very complex project. With that, I'll introduce Mr. John Bussey, who's our Buffalo District Special Projects Branch Chief. He'll continue with the technical presentation. And again, thanks very much for joining us here tonight and learning about the proposed plan. John?
So a lot of my presentation in the beginning is going to look awfully familiar because you saw it in the history video. Go to the next slide. So our fuse wrap objectives, we have 3 of them. We identify and evaluate sites. We clean up or control fuse wrap related material and just hammer in home the point that our commander made that our #1 objective with fuse wrap is protection of human health and the environment. Next slide, please. So you're wondering why it takes us so long. Well, CERCLA is why it takes us so long. It's the law of the land. It's Congress mandated that we follow this process. There are 3 groups here, as you can see on the slide. There's the pre-investigation phase, there's the investigation phase, and then there's the remedial action phase. Any of these steps can take 1 year to several years. It depends on the complexity of the site. We're currently in the feasibility study and proposed plan phase for the interim waste containment structure. And we have several other operable units, and I'll kind of walk you through that again, just kind of reaffirm what we had in the history video. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. So Niagara Falls storage site is situated within what was the Lake Ontario Ordnance Works. It was a TNT facility that came online in the early 1940s. It was decommissioned in 1943. Basically, we had a surplus of TNT during the World War II efforts, so they no longer needed the operation of that facility. The government had to find a different use for that structure, so we ultimately started the atomic energy program around the same time, and there was residues and waste material that was being generated as a result of that work, and it kind of found its way to Niagara Falls storage site where it was stored for a considerable length of time. If you hone in on the right-hand side there, you can see the smaller Niagara Falls storage site, and if you focus in on the dark blue, the interim waste containment structure, and you all know what that is, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. So we divided the site into 3 operable units. We did that when we issued a feasibility study work plan in 2009. It's basically how we were going to manage this site and get it through the CERCLA process. So we started with the interim waste containment structure, which poses the greatest potential risk to human health and the environment. And we figured whatever ultimate decision that we made on that operable unit would impact all the other operable units. The balance of plant, which is all the remaining site soils around the IWCS, as well as some of the infrastructure as well. And then the other operable unit's groundwater. On the next slide, I'm going to walk you through where we are in the timeline. Well, that kind of fades in. If we can hit it again. Look at that. I didn't realize it was that fancy. So in 2007, we did a remedial investigation. We issued it for public comment. We got several comments from the community and the regulators. We ultimately came out with a remedial investigation addendum in 2011 to address those comments and concerns. If you look at the left-hand side, we show the IWCS operable unit and where we're at. So we've done the feasibility study in 2015, which we issued just recently. We're scheduled to get to the record of decision, which codifies the selected remedy and what we'll take action on. If you look at the right-hand side, the other 2 operable units, if you think back to the previous slide, we still have that process to follow. And remember on the big CERCLA slide, so we're in the investigation phase. So these are the steps that were mandated by Congress to follow. So ultimately, before we get to any type of remedial action in Niagara Falls storage site, we want record of decisions in place for all the operable units. We want to take a holistic approach to the site. We have TBD down there, to be determined, for that remedial action phase of the circular process. It's going to take some time to get there. We don't know what the funding level is. Again, my commander kind of spoke to that already, but again, I just want to reassure the public the IWCS is performing as designed. We will continue to do our environmental surveillance program. We'll monitor radon, gamma, groundwater, surface water, and sediment until we can actually get to the remedial action phase. Next slide, please. So this is kind of shows what the IWCS looked like prior to construction. On the left-hand side, you can see what the site looked like in the 1970s, and we have the dotted line there showing the R10 residues. Obviously, that was stored on the ground just north of building 411 and 413 and 414, which are structures that were associated with the former water treatment plant of the Lake Ontario Ordnance Works. The black and white slide there kind of shows what those structures looked like in 1944. And then I think everybody's pretty familiar in this area. This was a visible structure in the area. Building 434 was the concrete silo that was associated with the Lake Ontario Ordnance Work. And it was in that structure where the K65 residues, the high activity residue material, was stored for a considerable length of time before it got transferred into the interim waste containment structure. So the placement of the waste into the interim waste containment structure is shown on this slide. Again, it was completed by the DOE in the 1980s. The high activity residue material, like the K65s, the L30s, the L50s, the F32s, you guys have heard these names, went into the former structures of the water treatment plant, building 411, 413, and 414. The R10 residues pretty much stayed where it was, and we kind of built the interim waste containment structure around it. A lot of the vicinity properties that were surrounding Niagara Falls storage site were also cleaned up by the DOE, and that material was consolidated in the interim waste containment structure as well around the R10 residues. Next slide, please. So one of the key takeaways that I want everybody, next slide, everybody knows what it looks like. Waste activity versus volume. So the K65 residues are 1% of the volume, but they represent 90% of the radioactivity in there. It's some pretty highly radioactive material. It's been a cause of concern for the community as well as the regulators for a considerable length of time, dating all the way back to the late 70s and early 80s. So in this portion of the presentation, I'm kind of going to walk you through how we evaluated the different alternatives, ultimately arriving at our preferred alternative selection. So the first thing we did in order to come up with alternatives for the interim waste containment structure was to divide it into subunits. We wanted to look at a range of alternatives. We didn't just want to look at everything stays in place or everything goes. We wanted some options in between, so we divided it into subunits. Subunit A had the K65s, the F32s, L30s, and L50 residues. Those are high activity residue material. Subunit B, which is everything pretty much south of that interior dike wall, was contaminated rubble and debris. Basically, when we took down building 434, that material got placed there. Some of the other buildings that were on site got placed in subunit B. And then subunit C contained the R10 residues and the contaminated soils from the cleanup of the vicinity properties. So these are the alternatives we looked at. No action is a baseline condition that we have to evaluate as part of the circular process within the feasibility study. Then we looked at everything from leaving everything in place to complete removal. We had some variations in there where we take out subunit A and keep everything else there, or we take out subunits A and B and keep everything else there. We ultimately, during our comprehensive evaluation that's contained within the feasibility study, determined that alternative 4 was the best alternative, and that's why we put it into the proposed plan. How do we arrive at that decision? We put it through CERCLA. CERCLA is a common theme through this presentation. I think I've said it 9 times already. So we take each alternative and we pass it through 3 categories of criteria. There's the threshold criteria, which is protection of human health and the environment. and also compliance with the laws and regulations of the land. Each alternative has to meet these threshold criteria to be carried forward in the evaluation, and our alternatives 2 through 4 did comply with the threshold criteria. And then we evaluate against the balancing criteria: long-term effectiveness, short-term effectiveness, implementability, and cost. And there's actually a preference in the regulations to reduce toxicity, mobility, or volume through treatment. And then the modifying criteria, the community and state acceptance. And that's why I emphasize that your comments tonight are very important for us to get to that selected remedy, which will codify in the record of decision. This is basically, we're going to slice it, interim waste containment structure right down the middle from north to south. And so the subsequent slides are kind of going to show that configuration. So we vertically exaggerated it. What you see above was with no vertical exaggeration. You can't really see what's going on, so we kind of squished it to kind of give you a sense of how this material is stored within there. And remember, this is sliced right down the middle from north to south. Next slide, please. So the first alternative we evaluated was leaving everything in place and basically putting an enhanced cap or final cap over the material. Some key takeaways from that is land use controls. We would have land use controls in place in federal ownership, security, operation, and maintenance for 1,000 years. We'd increase the cap thickness, as well as some other key features, which I can get to on the next slide to show you what that cap structure actually looks like. So on the left-hand side, you can see the existing clay cap, the way it looks. So we have 3 feet of clay, common fill, and then some topsoil and grass. And then if you look at the right-hand side, and this will be consistent with all the enhanced containment alternatives, this is how we plan to do the cover for each of those. We basically had an additional 4 feet above the existing clay cap. We put down a 60 mil geomembrane, which is impervious to water. It's kind of like putting down a tarp. And then we had a sand drainage layer, basically that wicks away the water so the water doesn't get into the waste material. Riprap is like stones and rocks and stuff, and that's added to keep animals from burrowing into the radioactive materials. And then again, subsurface soil or common fill, and then topsoil on top of that. So alternative 3A we looked at, basically we took out all the contents within buildings 411, 413, and 414. We would leave the building structures there. We'd fill that in with clean fill, and then we'd build that enhanced cap over the top of it. Again, some key takeaways from that is we take out the high activity residues like the K65s. We treat it with fly ash and cement, ultimately put it in steel containers and transport that to a licensed off-site disposal facility. But we're still left with land use controls, monitoring, maintenance, security for 1,000 years. And I wish it was this easy where we could just hack it off and go, but it's really not. So alternative B, we take basically the whole southern half of the cell, we take it away, and again, we build an enhanced cap over what remains. Again, the key features, again, we're treating the K65 residues, we're getting it off-site, but we're also removing the rubble that was surrounding the building structure from building 434 and some of the other appurtenances that were taken down when they consolidated radiological material within the IWCS. But again, 1,000 years of operation and maintenance. So through our comprehensive evaluation, what we determined was the best alternative was taking it all away, removing all our future land use controls, all operations and maintenance, and kind of returning the site back to its original condition is really what the goal is ultimately. So it could be beneficially reused, possibly by the community or other entities as you see fit. Next slide, please. So we put it through this comparative analysis here. This kind of shows a breakdown of how we rated each of those balancing criteria. If you think back a couple slides for each of the alternatives. One thing to note is for the enhanced containment options, It looks like the cost is low, but that's because we use the discounted value for operations and maintenance. Basically, the way we look at it is if you put $44 million into the bank today and earn 3.5% interest, you'd be able to cover the 1,000 years of operations and maintenance on those alternatives. Obviously, the federal government doesn't manage our money that way, so ultimately we decided there was another key factor why we chose alternative 4. We're also consolidating that material and placing it with the K65s that were remediated from Fernald, and shrinking the federal government's overall liability and proliferation of these small disposal sites that we have across the country was another reason that led us to choose alternative 4. Again, the preferred alternative is to take it all away. Can I hear a hoo-ha for that?
Yeah, right.
And next slide, I'll kind of walk you through the path forward, and I didn't realize that, yeah, that's awesome. So, again, we still have to get to the record of decision, like the commander stated in his opening remarks. It's a long process that we follow, but it's a good process, and ultimately we arrive at the right decision. But there are the necessary steps that we're mandated to follow in the implementation of this program. Ultimately, we need to get to a record of decision for all the operable units before we can move into that remedial action phase. And again, it's IWCS will remain protective of human health and the environment. The Corps will continue to do what we're doing out there, monitoring for gamma, radon, groundwater, surface water, sediment, to ensure that it remains protective until the funding becomes available that we can implement this remedy. And with that, I think I turn it back over to Doug.
Thanks, John. We're going to transition now into the formal comment period. Got the next slide, please. I'm going to just quickly talk about how this is going to work. I don't believe we have too many folks signed up. We still have 5 or 7. So this will take a little less than a half an hour once we get rolling. Again, this isn't the only way or the only time to get on the record. We recognize 3 minutes. We're giving each person, it's not a lot of time. You can online or by writing provide as extensive comments as you wish to get on the record. And those comments can be either mailed or emailed to the Corps. There's the address. All this information is in the packets as well. All the comments that are formally submitted either tonight in orally or in writing will be entered into the response to comments, and the Corps will be formally responding to all comments in the responsiveness summary. All the documents, all the technical documents, all of the decision documents, all of the responsive documents are entered into the administrative record, which will be available at hard copies at the administrative record locations, which include the Lewiston Public Library and the Youngstown Free Library, as well as at the Corps' offices, but you would have to make, there's security there, you'd have to do that by appointment, but you can go and see those documents there as well. And also most of them are obviously located online, as all of you saw during this process. Next slide. If you have any questions for folks at the Corps, all this contact information is also in your material. So phone, email, people are there to answer your questions. Next slide. So what I'm going to do is walk you through the process tonight. So we have 7 folks. I'm going to call you up in the order that you registered. You'll each be given 3 minutes. We'll ask you to please identify yourself by name and affiliation if you have one and you want to share that. Once you've stated your name, I'll start the clock. Again, you'll have 3 minutes, and I will give you a 30-second and 10-second warning to wrap up, and then we'll ask you to yield to the next person. All of the oral comments will be recorded by a stenographer here, so will be entered into the formal public record. Obviously, we're here to talk about the proposed plan for the IWCS, and so we hope you'll focus your comments on that. And again, If you have any further questions, or you want any further detailed information, or you want to talk to the Corps or anyone on the team, they're in the back of the room. They'll be here till 9 o'clock when we close down for the evening. So with that, I'm going to begin calling up folks. And if you would please go to this microphone. If you cannot stand or make your way there, then I can have the microphone brought to you where you're sitting if needs be. I'll call the person whose turn it is, and then the next person, so you know you're coming up next. So the first speaker will be Grace Austin, and the second speaker will be Heather. Is it Giambra? Giambra.
It's Giambra, but I don't have a comment.
Oh, so you're not going to comment? So then the second commenter will be Jeff Stone. So starting with Grace, are you okay to walk up there, or do you?
I'll be there.
Hi, my name is Grace Crew Austin. I grew up in this area, and when it was put in, I was just a baby in arms. So my grandparents owned the land where the new high school, Newport High School is, and I have done a cancer study I want to turn into someone. I will have to mail it because they can't copy from here. I'm concerned about the fact that it wasn't capped off when I was growing up. So what's going to happen when they do disperse the property and take it away? What's that going to do to us now? Because I'm third generation cancer victim right now. That was my comment.
Okay. And again, if you want to talk further with folks, they'll be in the back.
Okay,
Thank you, Grace. Jeff Stone. And after Jeff will be Jane Richardson.
Sorry about that. All right, I just want to say I'm really glad that the preferred alternative is number 4, and I support that. And that's really all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Jane Richardson.
No comment.
No comment. Ed McGreevy. Ed's not going to comment. Paul Casari.
Thank you. My name is Paul Casera. I'm the superintendent of schools at Lewiston Porter. We're very appreciative of that the Army Corps is suggesting and moving forward with the proposed plan number 4, so that we finally have opportunity to clean up our backyard. That is very important to all of us who work at the school system. As you move from the study to record of decision, it is vitally important to us that you consider the transportation of the materials, particularly those materials in subunits B and C. Once those are in the point where you're going to be moving those out to the whatever intermodal site is finally decided upon, it is absolutely essential that you understand that there are every given day within very close proximity 2,500 students and employees in front of that facility. And that really has to be taken into consideration. We're working on a new building site evacuation plan, and we're doing that because we know it's important for all schools to have that, but we really would prefer not to have to implement that. So if you could very much consider when you make that decision to move those materials, whatever intermodal site you decide upon, it's essential that you understand that you have a school system in very close proximity to the movement of those materials. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Amy Whitriall.
Regarding proposed option 4, hell yes.
Did anyone else want to make a formal public comment tonight that I did not call for any reason, did not get in on a card? This was the easiest public comment I have ever done, and I appreciate everyone coming out tonight. Yes, Tim.
And Amy didn't take her 3 minutes.
No, she did not.
I just wanted to praise the thoroughness of the Army Corps of Engineers And the steps that they're going to take assures that the people of this community don't become the ultimate victims to history's ultimate weapon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. Get home before the snow. We'll be here till 9 if you want to continue to ask questions. Have a good night.